In gratitude for our drama folks this morning, Jenny, Patrick, Karen. Gratitude for Marge, for Eric, our choir, for our ushers, bankers, light and sound. We gather in gratitude. We gather this morning with a heavy text. We make light of this heavy text, but it's still a heavy text. Just to review, though, we tend to give this story more importance than the Bible does. This story, this mythology, which is not to say that it's not real, it is very real. This story plays out daily, plays out hourly in our lives, I would argue. This mythology is given to us as a way of explaining how things came to be, a way of explaining the human condition, a way of explaining how come if there is a garden, we aren't in it. If we are loved by God, then how come we don't get to hang out in the Garden of Eden all the time? Why do we feel hopeless some of the time? Why do we despair? Why do we do what we do? Why is it that we can, on the one hand, start with gratitude and then on the other very quickly veer into something that does not resemble gratitude at all? Why are we the way that we are? This story is an etiology. It explains how things came to be. What Jenny and Karen and Patrick, I think we're doing, and doing well, was showing that while the serpent traditionally, in the first reading, traditionally is the one who is cunning and sly and scheming and almost forcing Eve into making a particular kind of decision, the second reading shows us that it is actually Eve who is more than capable of making this decision for herself. Perhaps, in fact, she is the one who is scheming. Perhaps she is the one who has been thinking about this for a good while. We are taught as clergy that when clergy get into trouble, things don't suddenly happen to us. We act as if they do, but they don't. And what I mean is that when someone is caught, let's say, embezzling funds, that person may say, it just happened. We are taught in our profession that actually that happened, that act of impropriety happened on the 100th time that you thought about it. That you had been thinking about it for 99 different days or 99 different ways, and on the 100th you finally relented, gave in to that temptation, acted upon that temptation, and found yourself in difficulty, shall we say. It's usually true for relationships when relationships go awry, when infidelity occurs. You didn't think about it once and then it just happened. 99 times, then on the 100th, it happened. On the other hand, a police officer in Montclair recently told me that many crimes that are committed, particularly by teenagers, do happen in the heat of a moment or in the passion of a moment. That many shoplifting crimes occur when someone has been to a store and has already paid for an object, and they're walking out of the door, and a person sees something and they think, I'll have that. Grabs it, walks out the door, the alarms go off, the police come. If they decide to book that person, and they go in front of a judge, they could have that on their record. Potentially that person could face difficulty in applying for college, and a particular path has been laid out for that individual that all stems from a moment where they just thought, I'll have that. Walter Mischel, in his book, The Marshmallow Test, some of you may have heard of the marshmallow test, lays this out very well. He designed an experiment for young children where he placed an object on a desk, usually a marshmallow, and said to the child, you may have this marshmallow now, or I'm going to leave, and when I come back, you can have 2. Young children have a great deal of difficulty with this situation. They see the marshmallow, they smell the marshmallow. They have yet to develop real coping mechanisms in dealing with the temptation of the marshmallow. And so the researcher leaves the room, and often for a 3-year-old, the marshmallow is in their mouth in a heartbeat. Sometimes the researcher will come back and say, "Where's the marshmallow?" And the child will say, "I don't know. But I would like the other one, please." By 6 or 7 years of age, most children have figured out ways to cope with the temptation of the marshmallow in front of them. They practice avoidance, meaning that they will get under the table so that they don't have to make eye contact with the marshmallow. They will stand on the other side of the room and face the wall. They will whistle, they will sing, they will do anything to get the marshmallow out of their mind until the researcher comes back, and then they can have another. Of course, some kids can't do it. They quote unquote, and I really do mean quote unquote, fail the test, meaning that they wolf the marshmallow down immediately, no matter how old they are. Mischel tracks these folks that took the test and sees that later in life, children that are able to wait out the 10 or 15 minutes with the temptation of the marshmallow in front of them, those that are able to delay gratification, tend to have better outcomes in relationships and employment and in schooling, with their criminal record, with rates of addiction, and so on and so forth. That those who can't wait tend to have other kinds of outcomes occur in their lives. Mischel's point in writing his book was not that, therefore, if your child fails the test, he or she is doomed to a life of difficulty, destruction, and so on down the line, but that there are strategies, there are mechanisms, there are ways to deal with this. You can do things like create if-then statements in your head. If I wait for a second marshmallow, then I will really enjoy that. If I have a marshmallow now, then I won't have one later. This is a thing that I've been trying to do with my 7-year-old son, and I keep thinking, I really ought to do this for myself a little more too. This is fantastic. I never thought of things this way. If I do something, then something else happens. In other words, I'm thinking a great deal about what I'm going to do next. Who is the sly one? Who is the cunning one in the story in the garden? Is it Eve? Or is it the serpent? Before the eating of the fruit, before the exposure, before the complete awareness of what has happened, Eve, at least in the second rendering that Jenny gave us, Eve is already scheming. She is processing. The serpent merely tells the truth to Eve. No, you won't die. The serpent is merely the accelerant in the fire of Eve's own passion, but not the source of it. This is where the conversation about sin in the church gets really bogged down, because there is actually a fundamental difference in outlook and worldview if you believe that the serpent or the devil is pushing you to do something evil in all places and at all times. The devil made me do it. The enemy awaits at all times. As opposed to the passion for self-adulation, power, dominance, violence, and narcissism already existing within us, and believing that the serpent is merely reflecting those desires back to us. Or put another way, I would argue that the serpent in the Garden of Eden is just a way of reflecting the mechanism of self-justification. Like a snake that slithers and sneaks up on its prey, moving silently and yet seemingly dangerously to most humans. Self-justification operates in much the same manner, silently, stealthily. That'll be okay. I can embezzle this money because my family needs it, or I want it, or the company won't miss it, or the boss will never notice, whatever it is. Then suddenly, it seems a line has been crossed. If I steal or cheat, it's because I need it or want it or I'm entitled to it. Because of all the other things that have happened in my life, I'm owed. If you think that once and only once, you'll probably stay out of trouble. Look in the mirror 100 times and say it over and over and over, and your own serpent will start to agree with you. You're right, Dave. You are owed. You're right, Dave. You are entitled. You deserve this. The forbidden fruit, the knowledge of good and evil, means that the two in human experience, good and evil, are paired together. One can't see pure evil without looking for a tinge of good. In every great tragedy, there is a man or woman who rushes to help those in need. And then when it abates and the community rushes to show goodwill, someone sends out fake emails from the Red Cross to try and scam people. Human experience is marked by a light shining in the darkness, and also a sense that even on the sunniest of days, those days might end. In reaching high into the tree, Eve seeks to elevate herself, literally, and on behalf of the human race. She elevates herself emotionally and intellectually and socially. From the off, she has a sense of hubris, and it gets the best of her. She reaches high not because the serpent told her to, but because she wanted to. Nothing more and nothing less. The humans in Genesis, they want knowledge more than they want trust. They want this crazy, balanced, yin and yang, good and evil, evil and good, all mixed together, never content to let one be one and the other be the other. And yet, this story does have God in it. God who interacts with these people who self-justify. These people with this very odd way of doing things. Everything in this story actually still hinges on the gardener and caring about the garden. Genesis seeks to affirm one very basic thing for us. The Lord never yields. The rules are not truly overcome. Someone gets the notion of outflanking the gardener, but the Lord does not cede the garden to another. Does not yield to the serpent, does not yield to the human beings, which is really good news. It happened again this week, just yesterday, in fact. I'm talking about the news. A very well-informed gentleman at the men's retreat and I were talking, and I was talking about what happened at Northern Arizona University on Friday, and he said, I hadn't heard about that. Some of you may know the story. It seems like two young gentlemen got into a fight. A scrap occurred, and perhaps 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 young men would have left the scene with black eyes or broken noses, bruised ribs perhaps. Instead, 1 was murdered, 4 ended up in the hospital. It's terrible news. It's terrible because of the way in which we are now altering our stance towards this terrible news. 561 children between the age of birth and 11 have been killed or injured by guns this year so far. 2,037 12 to 19-year-olds have been killed or injured by guns 2015 so far. 1,447 accidental shootings have taken place in the United States so far. Is this a sudden thing? Is this something that has just crept up on us, has sprung out of the blue? This something that we couldn't see coming? No. No. This this is an addiction. Like any addiction, the innocent are swept into the vortex. Like any addiction, the innocent feel powerless to stop it. Much like any other kind of addiction, there is a sense of powerlessness, reaching for the fruit. It's simply too hard not to do. We just got to keep going. To keep going. We've got to keep doing what we're doing because we're human beings, and this is just the way that it is. We've got to keep going and keep doing what we're doing because this is just how America is. This is how America was and how America is and will be. And like any addiction, that addiction means that our lives feel like they have become unmanageable. Many of us now have a sense that gun violence in America has become vastly unmanageable. We are powerless to stop this. Indeed, that is the first step in a 12-step program. We admitted that we were powerless over something and that our lives have become unmanageable. The second step is you come to believe that a power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity. The third step is that you make a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God. Those first 3 steps are a necessary component of our public discourse, I would argue. There is always a tendency to speak of addiction as if it is in the other, that it's too bad that it has impacted those people when in fact those people are all around you or are your spouse. But in fact, of course, it is all around us. It is all around us in the ways in which violence, and particularly gun violence, makes itself manifest in our society. And so we have to make some difficult choices. To make difficult choices about our own sense of self-justification, about keeping going to keep on going, about doing things the way that we've always done them. The gardener has not seeded the garden, Genesis claims. The gardener has never seeded the garden, Genesis claims. There are hundreds of thousands of people alive today in the United States because they would suggest that they did indeed turn their will over to God as a necessary component of combating an illness in their lives. There are hundreds of thousands of people who have sat in the rooms of 12-step programs all around this country, recognizing that their lives have become unmanageable and that they needed God's help. They needed the gardener's help. They needed the help of the one who would not seed the garden in order to go on and in order to combat their illness and their addiction. The language in our communities has shifted from outrage, how could this happen to us, to, listen, folks, you got to clean up your act. We can't go on like this, to just acceptance. This is who we are now. This is who we are now. 561 children between the age of birth and 11 years old, killed or injured by a gun in just 9 months. This is what it is. One day at a time. This is how anyone who has confronted an addiction has been able to do such a thing. One day at a time. One day at a time. Beautiful children of God here at Union Congregational, one day at a time. We must wrestle with this serpent of justifying the insane, of justifying why things are the way that they are, and tolerating it. One day at a time, we must seek to not justify the insane. One day at a time, we must seek to turn our lives over to the will of God, over to the goodness of God, over to the ways of God, who acts in peace and love. One day at a time, we, the children of God, The faithful call baloney on the scheming and planning to justify ourselves in light of the insanity of gun violence in America. One day at a time, we must seek out hope rather than despair. One day at a time, we realize that not only can't we go it alone, we don't have to. Indeed, millions of Americans are also in this place, also perfectly prepared to call a spade a shovel. One day at a time, we recognize that kids these days are only outliers in the sense that they are more hopeful than generations past. They are the most hopeful generation since people started compiling data on hope in society. That boomers and Gen Xers and Gen Yers have ready partners in naming our collective insanity. One day at a time, we recognize together that the gardener has not given up on the garden. And in fact, hundreds of thousands of people in America testify to that every day. They have life, they have hope, they have love, they have a sense of conviction. Why? Because they saw that life had become unmanageable and that their will had to rest in the ways of God. May it be so not just for those brave and courageous enough to go into a room and say, "Hi, my name is," but for all of us who find ourselves wrestling with the serpent, wrestling with what it is to be an American.